evening. My name is Mike D'Souza. I'm one of the ministers here in the East London Church of Christ, and I want to welcome everyone to our live Q&A tonight with our guest, Dr. Andy Boraci. Dr. Boakye is a lecturer in Religions and Theology at the University of Manchester, as well as being an author, historian, and New Testament critic. London born and bred, his first degree was actually in medical biochemistry at King's College, London, and he's a married father of two, a former rugby player, and a Spurs supporter, but we won't hold that against him. First things first, Dr. Boakye, is it okay if I call you Andy?
Absolutely.
It's great to have you with us. Thank you so much for giving up your valuable time to join us. I've known Andy for many years, and I'm very grateful just for him being able to be with us here tonight, online, live. Many of us have had recently the opportunity to listen to Andy's contribution to the Christianity and race discussion, initiated by the Thames Valley Churches and Watford Church for Black History Month last year. And tonight we have Andy joining us to be able to answer any questions which may be arising from his talk, and perhaps other questions related to the topic of race or racism and Christianity in the church. This evening, we also have two members of the East London Squad team, Squad being an acronym for Social, Cultural, Unity and Diversity. And that's Phoebe and Shona are going to be asking the questions that have been put forward by members of the congregation, and indeed anyone who wants to submit questions can do so via the link for that'll be on. Presumably it'll be on the screens, right? I'm assuming. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and hand over to Phoebe to go ahead and ask the questions. But again, Andy, thank you so much for being with us this evening. We're really grateful.
Yeah, just going to reiterate Mike's thanks. It's great to have you here. I've heard you speak before. You've got great insights and wisdom, so I'm really excited for this evening. You've recorded a talk for us. Do you have any additions you'd like to add to that?
Well, I mean, I hope the talk was clear and made basic sense. It was largely a sort of exegetical read into Galatians and how that informs modern ethnic discourse. I did want to say that I think I may have been slightly careless in my use of certain terms when describing what happened to Breonna Taylor and Trayvon Martin. Now, we all may have our own individual feelings about this, but for legal reasons, I think it was unwise of me to use the word murder too casually for them. No one was actually charged with Breonna Taylor's death, and Trayvon Martin's killer was acquitted. I just think it's important when we're involved in these kinds of very sensitive discussions that we're quite careful about the terminology that we use, because we don't want to misrepresent the stories. So I just wanted to add that caveat just for the sake of propriety, really. But other than that, I hope the class basically made sense and led to some fruitful discussions. I'm very happy to take your questions on that and any sort of associated issues this evening.
Okay, thanks for that.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you. I know I found it really helpful to listen to. I know I listened to it again this morning just to make sure it's at the top of my mind. But we have got a load of questions for you that have already come in, and I'm sure they'll continue to come in. Jack, do you happen to be able to share the screen? So we got the Slido on the Zoom screen as well, so we can start seeing those questions. Thank you. Amazing service. So we're going to try to work through as many of these questions as we can, but since there's so many, we're just going to work through them at as good a speed as possible, but also still getting some good quality answers in there. So I will start off with the first question, which is, how do you view the work of the East London Church in respect of creating a group to look at racial unity from a spiritual perspective? Are there any drawbacks to us having a squad group?
That's an excellent question. Let me sort of start with the second question first, but I think it kind of feeds its way backwards into the first question. There are probably several drawbacks of having a squad group, but you shouldn't let any of those drawbacks deter you. The drawbacks of having a squad group are that you are dealing with incredibly sensitive issues, which are likely to ruffle feathers and are likely to even potentially upset some people. But that in itself is not a reason not to have a squad group. I think you've, as a region, been incredibly brave. I think it is a group which can potentially address really important issues, not just for people's discipleship, but I think just for their broader connection with the world. And you know, I think because the spotlight is on race issues, that's kind of floated to the top. But you're dealing with social realities of different kinds, and they're central to how we apprehend the gospel. I hope that one thing that came across in my analysis of Galatians 2 is that ethno-racial unity and harmony was very high up on the list for Paul. I think it was high up on the list for Jesus. Part of the reason I think Jesus drew upon certain ethnic groups, even in his teaching material, was to make a specific point about the way God views his diverse creation. There's a specific reason why in Luke 10, Jesus draws on a Samaritan, you know, to be the person that helped the mugging victim, right? 2 priests walked by, but a Samaritan, a hated Samaritan. We know from John 4, Jews and Samaritans don't get on. Jesus picked on that specific ethnic group, that ethnic categorization, for the implicit purpose of showing that God loves all of his creation equally, and that even someone who was hated, you know, for his vices by the Jews at large could still you know, express the kinds of virtues which God values. So having a body, an organization, a group within your church that's dealing with these issues, that is sensitive to the needs of people, I think is an excellent idea. And you should never let the notion of drawbacks or naysayers or people slightly sneering at the idea deter you from what you're doing. It's invaluable work, and I'm sure you're already reaping the benefits of it.
Thanks for that. That's really helpful, because it can be easy to get caught up in the fact that some people don't like the idea of the squad. So thank you so much for that. And the next question is, what has been, okay, which one?
It keeps changing, just pick one of them.
All right. I'll go with the one with the most votes. What has been your experience, if any, of racism in the church?
Yeah, it's a good question. I always kind of, because I've done a few of these kinds of things now for various church groups. I was training Anglican clergy on this last year. I'm doing the same for the Manchester Methodist Network next month. And I always preface my comments by saying that I don't think I've ever experienced overt and sort of unashamedly rude racism in church. You know, it's not like someone's come and hurled a racial slur at me or something like that. I don't think for most people that would be the experience of racism. It's far more subtle forms of being patronized. I think it's experiencing the dominant culture being somewhat ignorant of its privilege. I think it's sometimes the use of certain ideas in quite cavalier fashion. So I personally, I would say what I've experienced is more a racism that's born out of ignorance. People saying and doing things which are all well-intentioned, but because of ignorance, they come across in a way that is patronizing. Now I'm fairly thick-skinned. I'm not, it takes a lot to offend me, but it does concern me about the broader unity of God's people when I sometimes hear certain things said and certain approaches taken when people are ignorant of its proclivity to offend and ignorant of how likely certain things are to offend. And when I say offend, I don't just mean, you know, to upset someone, but I mean to make someone question their sense of worth and sense of value. So, as I say, it's usually subtle, but we shouldn't think that because it's subtle that it's not destructive, because it is.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing that. I think it is easy to feel like if something's not like hitting you in the face, then it doesn't exist. But it definitely, those subtleties are definitely there. So yeah, appreciate that. So we'll keep going. So the next question is, how does a Christian know when they are becoming too involved in political or social issues?
I mean, I'm not sure that you do, to be brutally honest. First of all, let me start by saying this. I think there is this really unhelpful and unnatural attempt to try to separate the gospel from political and social issues. And I think as believing people, we really need to stop doing this. We have sometimes this idea that Christianity is to do with quote unquote spiritual issues, and that what we're calling political issues or issues of justice or issues of affecting, you know, various social classes or the marginalization of women or the disabled or whoever, that these are somehow sort of tacked onto the end of the gospel, like there's some kind of appendage which we're, you know, supposed to have some opinion about and maybe be able to throw a Bible verse here or there, but we're not supposed to be, as the question implies, too involved in, because it somehow takes away from what we should be really doing. And I mean, it's such a fundamental misunderstanding of the gospel that it will, in my view, it will ultimately, unhelpfully color what you think the gospel is. The gospel is a deeply, deeply social and political message. Think about where it came from. Think about the minor prophets. These were people who were all deeply invested in social justice. God was calling them to turn the tide on the oppression of the marginalized, widows, orphans. Think about the opening of Isaiah's prophecy. You know, come, let us reason. You know, defend the orphan, defend the widow. Think of Amos, probably the first writing prophet, Amos 5:21. I hate your assemblies. I can't stand your new moon festivals. Then in verse 24, but let justice flow like a river. This is the soil from which the gospel emerged. And when Jesus first took up the mantle from John the Baptist in Mark 1, and he said, repent and believe, we sometimes get this idea that repent is about giving up your private sins. There is no way Jesus marched into a group of Jews who had the law to tell them, give up your private sins. They already knew that better than most. What he meant was give up your political agenda and take on the agenda of God. I mean, you simply cannot depoliticize the gospel. So, I mean, I get asked sometimes, you know, what about people going on marches, you know, for things like, I don't know, climate change or I would say there was a time, particularly in the UK, when the church's voice in social issues was deeply respected. Now it's become a bit of a nonsense voice. And I think that needs turning around. So in my view, you can't be too involved in political or social issues. If you're a Christian, you are by definition involved in a political and social issue. The only question is, how do you use your gifts and what God has given you to make a difference? It may be the case that you're not the kind who should be, you know, standing on some platform with a loud hailer, but by the same token, whatever it is that God's given you that can make a difference, that's something which you ought to invest in.
Wow. There was so much meat in that answer. Thank you so much. I just want to tag on another question to that, because I think you're probably the first person that I've heard openly say, like, we can't separate it. and I've been a Christian for coming up to 7 years. So so how do we unlearn and relearn what we should be doing, and get rid of the idea that we have to separate it? Where do we start?
Okay, let me just add a quick caveat. All right, I'm going to answer the questions as honestly as I know how. I don't want people to want to come and shoot me afterwards. Okay, so I'm going to give you my honest answer to that question. And again, anyone who's watching, just please try and, make like George Michael and listen without prejudice. All right, don't hate me. Right? Here's what I would say. I say the first thing we've got to do is we've got to unlearn church protocols. I think far too much of our discipleship is about what church leaders and church dogma tells us we ought to be thinking about our relationship with God. One of the quintessential failures of churches, and I mean all churches, and I include myself in this category, is what I think is an abject failure to learn how to tell our own story of what it means to walk with God. And the first stage of that is to go back to the texts themselves, to forget your denominational commitments and your church commitments and your doctrinal obligations, and just go back to our story, the story of a beautiful world made by a kind and loving God, which was destroyed by sin and which God took the initiative to restore by electing one people who themselves failed. And so that vocation being heaped up on one special individual from that group, the Messiah, Jesus, and how his life and work and death and resurrection then led to the inauguration of these communities of people with resurrection faith, who then saw it as their work to color the world around them with the power of the gospel. And we have to go back to that story. And when you do, I think these sorts of questions about separating politics and separating social issues and those stop becoming questions once we immerse ourselves in our central story. And I think it's a story which even the unbelievers would be, would welcome and would grasp. Then I think so many of these sub-questions stop being questions. So many of the things we argue about stop being arguments. That the gospel in itself, I think, is its own answer to so many of the quandaries that get thrown up from years of sort of dogmatic dressing up of our faith.
I'm so glad this is recorded, because I feel like I need to re-listen, because it's so good, but ultimately stripping it back down to the essence of the gospel, which I love. So the next question is, as a young person, how do I lovingly yet firmly converse with older disciples that don't consider racial injustice as biblical injustice?
That's a fantastic question, and it sounds like one which is born from some experiences. Yeah. I think you've zeroed in on something really important here, and that I think when you do get a bit long in the tooth in the faith, you do start to see the Christian faith as something which is kind of is so uniquely spiritual that it is somehow disconnected from issues of social justice. And so a term like biblical injustice normally points to spiritual realities, most of which revolve around the notion of sin. Now, the truth is, racial injustice is one of the major biblical injustices. The truth is, if you think about the marginalization of Gentiles, and think about even what happened in the post-New Testament period, because then things reverse. By the end of the first century, the ancient Jesus movement was largely a Gentile movement, and some of our greatest spokesmen as of later leaders of the church after the apostles, people like Justin Martyr, were raging anti-Semites and were awful to the Jews. So right from the period of the penning of the New Testament, right to the sub-apostolic period in the sort of 2nd and 3rd centuries, a key injustice was racial injustice. So the idea of even of splitting racial injustice from biblical injustice, I think is in itself wrong. I think you can do with older Christians the same thing that you do with everyone. You approach them sensitively and respectfully, right? It says in 1 Timothy 5, I believe, that you should, treat all older men as fathers, older women as mothers. So you approach them respectfully, like you were talking to your own physical mother or father, and you appeal to them with humility. That's the only thing you can do. But something else, again, I cautiously and humbly tack onto the end of this. Much of the work that us older folks are doing is for the sake of subsequent generations. That there are times, and I don't mean this to sound pessimistic or dismissive, but there are times when I think that my generation, right, Generation X, what we're doing is not going to help us. We'll all be old and probably dead before any of this really takes root. We do this for Generation Z, for my children's generation. So, this is not to say that, the thoughts and opinions of older people are not as central or as important, but we do have to think about the future. We've got to think about legacy and what we're building. And the other thing I would say is that whether you're old or young, you've got to talk to people from minority cultures. And you ask yourself if their experiences don't represent a biblical injustice. Because to say that is almost to say something close to God is not as concerned about those kinds of injustice as he is about others. And that is a real disservice to our gospel.
Yeah, thanks so much.
The answer in there somewhere. Sorry for interrupting, Shona.
No, yeah, definitely. I think, like Phoebe said, it'll be good, I think, not just for us, but for everyone to kind of go back and listen and see what we can pull out of that as well, because I think so much of what I'm hearing you say is kind of go back to the Gospels, go back to our story, go back to what it says. And some of this stuff that we've made really complicated is actually quite simple, and it's just like what Jesus was saying the whole time. So yeah, I really appreciate that. I think the next question is actually a bit similar in a way, just instead of generational, it's more kind of back to racial. It says, as a white disciple, I've felt guilty because of my skin color. With the Galatian issue about race, are we not in danger of alienating some when we Christians emphasize Black Lives Matter?
And first of all, thank you for the question. It's a good question. You're probably not the only person who's feeling this. And again, I want you to listen carefully to my answer and listen without prejudice, and try to remember, and this is part of what I think becomes so difficult for me as someone who is trying to educate about these issues, but is also a Black man as well, right? Some of this is quite difficult to say. As a white disciple, and again, please don't hate me, you have the privilege of feeling guilty, but not having to deal with that. I'm afraid that's just part of the benefit of being part of the dominant culture, right? I'm talking about, and we're all talking about, issues where a particular group may face marginalization and even violence. So if all you feel is guilt, thank your lucky stars. The second thing I'd say is that guilt isn't always such a bad emotion to feel initially. If it becomes the predominant thing you feel, then something has gone very wrong. But I know if I sin, I feel guilty, and then I do something about it. And that should be the response, I think, of every white disciple. The third thing I'd say is that the Black contingent of the church, and by that I mean the church worldwide, cannot do this alone. We 100% need our white brothers and sisters to be on board. In some respects, we almost need you more to be on board than even we need our Black brothers and sisters. Because we need you to do some pretty serious self-evaluation. And much like Shona was saying in the introduction to the question, it's a self-evaluation to take us back to the heart of the gospel. We're not, no one here really is after some magic tricks or some strange, new philosophy which is going to somehow correct this problem, but rather radical self-reflection which gets us back to what it means to live in this world like Jesus Christ. So, are we in danger of alienating some? Probably. Again, don't let that be a barrier. And I'm not sure that the Christian's role is to be emphasizing Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter, isn't. It's not like it's not its own facet of the gospel. It's simply the acknowledgement of a social ill, as far as I'm concerned. When I say, when I talk about Black Lives Matter, I purely mean the sentiment. I'm not referring to any groups or any pressure group or any political organization or anything like that. I'm talking about the social sentiment that life is precious, that God values all life in the same way. But if a social reality reflects the notion that one particular cross-section of the community is not valued, then it is a collective human response to put that right. That's all that Black Lives Matter means. So to emphasize Black Lives Matter, to cite the question, is only to say, what work do we have to do to achieve an equal society? That's all it is. It's not about political affiliations. I personally, and I'm not speaking for everyone, I personally couldn't care less about any group called Black Lives Matter. I'm not associated with any. I don't particularly want to be associated with any. I'll, to quote Malcolm X, work with everybody or against everybody to achieve what's right. But it's the acknowledgement of something that's wrong in society. Let me say this finally. The next stage, and I've been involved in some discussions about this, which some have gone well, some haven't gone so well. And I'm not even necessarily saying I know how to do this, especially in a Christian context. But I don't think, and again, I leave you to disagree, I don't think that the majority culture in any context, in any social situation, sees itself as a race. Right, I was in Ghana a couple of years ago, and I wasn't a Black man, I was just a man. Right, it didn't matter. Now, if a white person came in, somebody in Ghana, they were a white man. In England, I'm a Black man. In England, white people aren't white, they're just people. And so there is, in any social situation, the majority kind of becomes the standard. Now, what's happened, I think, in the world is that almost wherever you are, white skin is seen as a standard. It's the one thing that doesn't need to be qualified in any way. Let me give you a very simple example of this. I never use the term African American, because I think it's massively patronizing. I would rather say Black American, because the only Americans who don't need to qualify their Americanness as white people, which to me is crazy. This is a land they came to and it was already occupied. So even the people who were originally there, they're now Native Americans. They have to have their Americanness qualified. Explain that to me. Why aren't white Americans called European Americans, which is precisely what they are if we're going to be consistent. Now, the notion that you don't have to qualify your color in a context means that your color's not seen. And that, to me, is the definition of privilege. And that's got to be deconstructed. The next stage of this discourse, I don't think we're quite there yet, but the next stage of this discourse is the deconstruction of whiteness. It has to be understood politically. And I think it has to be understood spiritually and religiously as well. So don't let your guilt overwhelm you. Let your guilt drive you to action. Black Lives Matter is not about affiliation to groups. It's about recognizing a social ill.
Wow. If I'm honest, reading that question was a bit hard for me, but I am grateful for a space like this where this person can ask the question, and I think your answer was fantastic. Yeah, I'm really grateful for the way you answered that. I think this next question will probably help that person as well. What do you think is the greatest barrier to overcoming ethnic marginalization in the church?
One word: fear. I just think as human beings, we're pretty terrible at having difficult conversations. We just don't know how to do it. We're terrified of causing offense and terrified of offending. We're terrified of treading on toes. We're terrified of getting our toes trodden on. And so much of what we feel just goes unspoken. I think people who are ethnically marginalized don't want to put their head above the parapet because they're scared it's going to get blown off, that they're going to be spoken down to, that they're not going to be taken seriously. I think that's the biggest barrier. I think there are other barriers, but I think we're still at such a sort of, strangely, we're still at a really sort of embryonic stage of this discussion. And it certainly in the circles that I've moved in, it's still the case that we have to create the space for this conversation to happen maturely and without fear. You know, it's the same thing that Phoebe was saying recently just now about the question that was asked before. I'm glad that person who was talking about his guilt felt that he or she could ask that question. It's really important that you feel safe enough to ask that question. And I hope this is a space that's safe enough to ask all of those questions. However, we've really got to work at that. People shouldn't be afraid to talk. And once we do, once people feel like they can talk about their experiences without the fear of judgment, then the people who don't understand this and the people who might want to be disconnected from it will see why they shouldn't be.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I think, yeah, I can personally think of a lot of times when fear has stopped me from either speaking up or defending someone, you know, the whole bystander effect issue of just kind of seeing something and being afraid to say something. And that's something that I think, yeah, we really need to work on.
Yeah.
Great. So the next question is, how do you explain to people that having a diverse church doesn't necessarily equate to social justice, whether it's racial, gender, etc.?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Again, I think it begins with discussion, because what you'll find is that even in diverse churches, and our church, I think, is incredibly diverse. It's one of the strengths of our family of churches, to be honest, is that we do have, I think, a reasonably diverse set of congregations. And yet we have people who have stories of racial marginalization. So the first thing is that people have, again, got to listen to other people's stories. And again, this goes back to what I was saying about how much we need our white disciples and our white brothers and sisters to be on board with this. Because it's very easy to sort of sit back and say, well, look, our church is, you know, we've got all colors of the rainbow here, so there's no problem. And it's only until you start to listen to people's stories that you realize, well, actually, that there are problems. So that's the first thing. I think once you started to have those conversations, then you start to realize that this is, you know, it's an issue of community, but it's also an issue of individuals. It's to do with how individuals treat one another. And then I think that it becomes, you know, even in a very diverse community, it becomes a lot more stark. And I think as well, it's not just about how you treat Black people in the church, it's how you treat non-white people more broadly. So diversity is important, and it's the first stage. But once you listen to people's stories, you realize that it's not the only stage, it's just the beginning. So again, just make sure that these conversations are free flowing. And again, this goes back to the importance of having a squad group. This is a group that can monitor and can engineer and can facilitate these kinds of discussions, which is so important.
Absolutely, thank you for that. How, as a church, do you think we can attract more white English people, particularly colleagues and peers?
Yes, that's a good question. Again, I would start by saying that we've got to unlearn some of our old practices. Now, I've been in the church, and I didn't have a religious upbringing, by the way. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I didn't. So I've been in the church for 28 years, something like that. And in that time, I've always felt like a ministry that was considered healthy was one that was growing quickly. For some time now, I've not accepted that. And I think the difficulty comes in that some people, and I think, again, at the risk of buying into any stereotypes, which I ought to avoid, I think by and large, people in the UK tend to be, I mean white people in the UK, tend to be more reserved, more suspicious about religion. White Americans tend to be much more religious. We're much more likely to be agnostic and to be suspicious about religion in this country. And we're white, I like to think English people, British people, but certainly I think the white and the English are not the kind who want to air their laundry in public. And so they're the kind of people who you only attract by relationship. They're the kind of people that you draw in by getting alongside them. Most people don't want to hear a religious lecture from anyone. What they want to see is, what does this belief that you have actually do for you? So relationship, what that does is it says to someone, here's what my faith in Jesus does for my life. And I think that's how you will attract white English folk. Bashing, like in Africa, you stand up in the middle of the streets and start waving a Bible about, and especially where I'm from, in Ghana, in other parts of West Africa, yeah, you can pack a room full of people wanting to hear religious lectures in a heartbeat. That just doesn't, culturally, that just doesn't do anything here. So we've got to get away from this idea that unless people are becoming Christians really quickly, that we're failing. right? Leave the problem of conversion, quote unquote, to God, and let us worry about how do we project divine love and the witness of Jesus Christ into the world. And sometimes that can be a massively slow burn, and sometimes it can actually have nothing to do with talking about religion. It can just be about letting who you are, a life that's informed by discipleship to Christ, be a public witness to the people who are nearest and dearest to you. You know, my wife would never, if anyone stopped my wife, and my wife came from a Nigerian Pentecostal background, but if anyone had stopped her on the streets and asked her to come to some religious meeting, she'd probably have cursed at him and been on her way. You know, it's only because her, you know, family member brought her along that she came. So think relationship and life informed by Christ. That's what I think will attract, and not just white English people, but I think even, you know, just be irreligious. You know, they will be far more attracted by that than they will be, as I say, by religious lectures.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks so much. All right, so going into the next one, do you think we are sufficiently sensitive to white cultures which have also been subjected to empire or colonial attitudes? I think then they put in brackets as the Irish.
I don't think we are, but I'm not sure that that's entirely unjustified. I think that the transatlantic slave trade is probably the most well-known slave trade, but it's not the only one. There are lots of cultures who've suffered at the hands of slave masters. There are some who sadly still do to this day. The problem is, and this is not to slight the question, because the question is actually an excellent one. The problem is that historically, white skin is privileged. Part of the reason why the transatlantic slave trade went on as long as it did, at least certainly in America, it went on slightly shorter in Britain and Europe. And part of the reason why it appeared to be so easy to justify is that you had religious leaders using the biblical text to teach that Black people didn't have a soul. You had people using Genesis 6, I believe, or Genesis 9, I'll need to double check that, and arguing that the Hamitic peoples who descended from Ham therefore inherited the curse, even though the phrase curse of Ham never actually appears in the text. It's actually Canaan who's cursed, not Ham, but we'll leave the exegesis to one side for a moment. And so even in slave settings, you had slave church over here and white American church over here. And white American church was, you know, all sorts of celebrating the gospel. Black American church was slaves, obey your masters. Do what you're told, otherwise you'll suffer with many stripes. And this kind of thing. And so because you constantly had Black bodies and Black skin being denigrated in that way, it was much easier to justify. So although non-Black cultures have suffered, the legacy of it hasn't persisted. Now it's interesting you put Irish in brackets there. Now, have the Irish suffered? Of course they have. Virtually no nation on earth hasn't suffered. I think much Irish suffering actually has been more to do with sort of religious conflicts than anything else. But at least I'm not aware, and forgive me if I'm ignorant of this, but I'm not aware of a persistent legacy of devaluing of the Irish. And the reason for that, and again, forgive me for being stark, is because they're white. history has privileged whiteness. I don't think I'm saying anything, it might sound a bit heavy as I say it, but I don't think I'm saying anything remarkable there. I really don't. So the answer to your question is yes. And I think it's important to acknowledge that it's not only melanated peoples who've suffered from the injustice of slavery or of marginalization. The Jews suffered horribly during the Holocaust. The Muslims, 1 million Muslims were slaughtered in Srebrenica. Every peoples have suffered. And I don't think this is not about competitive suffering. It's not about my suffering is worse than your suffering. But I do think we have to think about the legacy of certain kinds of suffering and how those legacies linger and why they linger. There's a reason why a number, probably 6 or 7 key studies, most of which have happened in the States, have strongly suggested that there are huge cross sections of the Black community who still feel the legacy of slavery centuries after it was abolished. There's a reason for that.
Wow, I'm trying to like control my head because I find myself nodding vigorously because I'm like, wow, yes, like, yeah. And I love what you're saying about legacy and history and how that's played into the situation that we're in today. And I think I found it really helpful to research and understand history to help me understand why we are here today. So I'd encourage like everybody who's kind of interested in these kind of things to look at the origin of it, because it didn't just happen, it didn't start today, but the legacy does live today.
Yep.
All that being said, let's go on to our next question. Yesterday, an African American was awarded £100 million in damages from Tesla for racial abuse. Should Christians pursue justice in the courts?
If I could get 100 million quid, you're darn right I'll pursue justice in the courts. Should we pursue justice in the courts? I'm tempted to say yes, because racism is not just a moral issue, it's a legal issue as well. And as long as people think that racism will go unpunished, there are some people who will only, they say that there are some people who learn because you teach them, and there are some people who only learn from clearing up debris. And I think there are some people who need to clear up some debris. And if that's £100 million kick in the gut, then good. Then let that be the first part of your lesson, that racism won't be tolerated. I think racism has got to be made intolerable. People have got to feel that they've got to feel that racism's wrong. Not just hear about it or read about it. They've got to feel that it's wrong. Then that's when I think you see change. Who's the empiricist? Crumdy's name got out of my head. Never mind. I'll remember his name later. But passion precedes rationale. It precedes reason. We look for ways to fix things because we feel that they're wrong. And again, it's just the nature of humanity. Some people don't feel that something's wrong until you hit them in the pocket. And for that reason, I think it's right. Now, am I saying we should be sort of slipping on banana peels and suing Tesco's? No, but if it's racial injustice, some people will only feel its wrongness when they're hit in the pocket. And I don't think that's a bad thing.
Yeah, definitely a lot of money there. But but yeah, it is something to, because I even think about everything you're saying about like America and how kind of racism is in America, how it's different than it is, here, even though there's both so many things, but I think even growing up in America as well, it's like you see the way that people are and the way that they just don't think that it's wrong the way that they are, and the way that a lot of Americans especially, and again, this is just from my experience growing up there, feel very emboldened to have their opinions because it's a free country and I can say what I want. And so yeah, definitely sometimes they need that, like, it's a free country, that doesn't mean you can say and do whatever you want type thing. But yeah, definitely thank you for that. So then the next one is, how can we as a collective and individuals do better in being anti-racist?
I mean, that's such a huge question. I'm not going to be able to give a full answer, but I think where it begins is you've got to understand what racism actually is. I think part of the reason why in a lot of cross sections of the community people aren't involved in anti-racist work is because they think unless people are being called the N-word, or there are crosses burning in gardens, that's not there is no racism. I've actually heard people say that racism is a minor problem. No, people don't experience racism, and what they mean is, in a bygone era, there was much more sort of virulent and in your face type racism, which I think it's rarer today. It doesn't happen by anywhere near the same sort of frequency, but as I mentioned, the kind of racism that we even experience sometimes in churches, I think racism as a kind of institutionalized and systemic evil manifests itself in all kinds of ways. I think here's what I would say to a group of believing people, is that the first thing I think we've got to do is we've got to understand why racism is so out of kilter with the kingdom of God. Anybody who understood Jesus's message I don't think you can, and I think I even mentioned this in the talk, I don't think it's possible to be racist and Christian. Right? We can divide over all kinds of things. Can you be a Christian and a Trump supporter? Absolutely you can. Can you be a Christian and a Hillary Clinton, when that race was going on, supporter? Yes, you can. You can have that debate, but you shouldn't divide on it. Can you be a Christian and believe in, I don't know, that women should be able to preach sermons? Yeah, you can. And other people will say, well, no, women shouldn't be preaching sermons. You can have that debate, but you shouldn't divide over it. But can you be racist and Christian? I actually don't think you can. So the two things are important. Like I said, you've got to be clear on what racism actually is. You can't be anti-racist if you don't know what it means to be racist. But your first port of call in that is, when Jesus preached the kingdom of God, what did he mean? And once you've got your head around what racism is, ask yourself if that vision could be manifest in some kind of harmony with racism. And I would say there's no way. And I would say Paul's attempt to unite Jew and Gentile is an absolute case in point. I mean, had that debate not at least found some resolution, and I don't even think it found perfect resolution, but had it not found some resolution, I don't think there could have been a church today. Had Paul not been kind of supernaturally drafted in to speak the message to the Gentiles, to this day, the church would be a Jewish sect in Palestine, and we'd all be something else. And we hear of Christians and we think, oh yeah, some weird Middle Eastern people think some crucified Jew was special. But we certainly wouldn't be declaring that Jesus is Lord and Christ. that just wouldn't happen. But had racism taken hold, had that vision that God's worldwide family couldn't happen, there'd be no church. Right from when God called Abraham, what did he say? I'll make you the father of what? Many nations. That's what Abraham means. Av in Hebrew means father, and the harm bit means multiple nations. His name actually means father of many nations. If that vision couldn't manifest, no church. So that's how you be anti-racist. Again, it goes back to recover our story. Once you recover our story, there's no space for racism.
Oh, wow. Wow. Yeah, I'm watching this straight after this. I'm gonna rewatch this. Yeah, you said a lot then. Yes, racism looks different today. Yes, and you cannot be a disciple. You cannot call yourself a Christian and be racist. Line in the sand, that is it. Amen. It is not it. God's kingdom and racism, they're not aligned at all. And I love that you drew a line in the sand there. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so this is our last question.
Okay.
And that goes, how does Matthew 5:39 to 41, turn the other cheek, go the extra mile, etc., contribute in knowing how we should respond to those who are unjust towards us, given Matthew 5:6?
Matthew 5:6, is that blessed are those of you who are persecuted? Is that what it says? I can't remember. I'll have to look that up, sorry. Just so I don't talk nonsense. Matthew 5:6. Oh, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, because for they'll be satisfied. How does Matthew contribute in knowing how we should respond to those who are unjust towards us? Yeah, I mean, first of all, let's be very clear about what Jesus was not saying here. All right, if you're walking down the high street one evening and some drunken psychopath comes and slaps you in the face and then walks off, don't call him back and say, excuse me, could you slap me on the other cheek as well? What Jesus was saying here, and it has to be understood in the context of the kingdom of God, is that the approach of some, and I think it gets exaggerated sometimes, but the approach of some that God's kingdom couldn't come as long as there were Gentile overlords in the Holy Lands, and that the only way to deal with that was to bring this regime down violently, would never work. That's what Jesus means when he says turn the other cheek. He's saying, look, if you think some violent aggression against Rome is going to help, look, when they slap your left cheek, you might as well show them your right cheek, because that's not how the kingdom will come. He was actually introducing a way which didn't involve compromise with Rome. It didn't involve marginalizing those who you felt didn't keep the law, like the Pharisees did. It didn't involve collusion with Rome, like the Herodians, and it didn't involve trying to line your pockets, like the Sadducees. He was bringing an entirely revolutionary way of being God's people, which did involve going the extra mile, and it involved, well, ultimately involved a cross. So in terms of knowing how we should respond to those who are unjust with us, we have to know that the ultimate purposes of God are achieved by love. So if someone is unloving towards us, what our spirit should tell us is that his behavior is not what God desires. This person's behavior is not what's going to bring about God's kingdom. What this passage should not be seen as is an invitation to be a doormat. If that's what it was, well, then Jesus wasn't even consistent with his own teaching, because that's not what he was. But, and I will say this to the, particularly to the Black disciples on the call, and to Black people on the call, whether you believe or not, becoming bitter and being angry at white people will never achieve the purposes of God. And that's hard if you've suffered racist abuse. If you feel like you have, that your life in some way has been compromised, I mean, seriously compromised, and even maybe even violently compromised because of racism, that's a really, really challenging thing to do. But look, we serve a Lord who told us to love our enemies. And sometimes I think we just have to sit with these passages and think to ourselves, what does this really mean? Jesus was saying to the Jews, and effectively in this context, when he said love your enemies, he was saying these Roman overlords who in some contexts have made our lives hell. In other words, in other ways they didn't, but in some ways they made life for the Jews hell. And they made it difficult even in some respects to be Jews. And he says, you've got to feel about them the way you do about your own family. You have to love your enemies. And unless as an anti-racist people, we have that at the core of our vision, then we just end up becoming bitter at white people. And that's not our aim. Our aim is the universal value of all people and a universal brotherhood under Christ. That won't happen as long as we're bitter. Yeah, I think I'll say more than that.
Thanks so much for that one as well. I think, oh, I wish we could keep going and just keep getting through all of these questions. I think that was really, I think, a really good one to end on, actually. And just to think about more, like, for all of us, what was Jesus saying? How can we look into these things? How can we go back to the story and go back to the gospel and every single kind of issue that we deal with? That's definitely something that I've taken away from tonight. And I just, really appreciate kind of all of the answers that you've given. And especially that last one is something to meditate on. So I think Jack is going to come round us out now, but I think for me and Phoebe, thank you so much, Andy, for all of that. It was really, really helpful.
And thank you for officiating. You made the experience all very smooth and simple, so thank you.
Wow. I just want to say a huge thank you. Firstly, to our interviewees, thank you very much, Shona and Phoebe. We'll give you a little round of applause. That was incredibly well done. Appreciate you guys leading us through those questions and really helping us with tonight's discussion. And Andy, thank you so much. I think I was honestly, some of those questions, they're hard, they're really challenging. And I mean, for different of us, is obviously this evokes different emotions, and it can be touchy, some of these conversations, but I so appreciate just the depth of wisdom you brought to that and the many pauses you had as well. I know you were trying to think very carefully on how to answer many of those questions. But I so appreciate that. I think many of us will be probably going back and re-listening. I think some of your answers just really, really helpful. Thank you so much. And I'm sure even bringing your own experience to this as well, and your own wisdom. We so appreciate you not just sharing your wisdom, but sharing your life with us in this discussion. So thank you very, very much. And thank you for all of you for being here today. Thank you for tuning in, whether it be on YouTube or here on Zoom. And I really do hope you gathered something from tonight's discussion and conversation. And obviously, this is an ongoing thing. We wanted to have some special focuses on this during this month, October being Black History Month, but obviously devoting a squad here in the East and wanting to just continue to tackle this just really, really important subject as we learn to collectively be God's people, his kingdom and his family together. So one final kind of round of applause for Andy and the interviewees. Thank you so much for joining us. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to pray just to close our evening out together, and then we'll close tonight's stream. Dear Father God, we thank you so much for this evening and this time together. God, thank you so much for the incredible God and Father that you are. Thank you for the just amazing love that you pour out to each and every one of us. How you have adopted us into your family, as your sons and daughters, Lord, and that we not only get to be in a loving relationship with you, but also with each other as well. And the truth is, God, we just make so many mistakes, and we mess up, and we bring our own kind of sin and baggage and challenges to the table, God, and really learning how to love one another fully, love one another when it's uncomfortable, love through any kind of barriers that the world put up, to love through any barriers that sometimes our own hearts and our own different things can put in the way. God, I pray that you teach us to be your people, because we also want to reflect your love to the world around us. We want to be a city on a hill, a light to the world, and we want to shine a bright light to all those around us, Lord. So I pray you help us as a church to navigate these topics, to continue to having discussions like this, both online and offline as well, individually, one-to-one, and in groups. God, I pray you keep guiding us towards holiness, to righteousness, to peace, to love, to really just being like you as we learn to love you and love others as well. We thank you so much, and thank you for Andy being here with us today. We pray in your son's name. Amen. Thanks again, and thank you all for joining us.